Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into a case that, well, it's captured global attention for well over a decade now. It's been called the most heavily reported missing person case in modern history. We're talking, of course, about the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. For anyone who might need a refresher, or perhaps wasn't following it so closely back then, Madeleine Beth McCann was a British 3-year-old. She vanished from her bed in a holiday apartment. This was in Praia da Luz, Lagos, Portugal, on the evening of May 3rd, 2007. Her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, had left her and her 2-year-old twin siblings asleep. They were in their ground floor apartment. They themselves were dining with friends, just 55 meters away at a tapas restaurant. Kate discovered Madeleine was missing around 10:00 p.m. that night.
And what's really fascinating here, I think, is just the sheer volume and the complexity of the information surrounding this case. It's immense. You go from the immediate, frantic searches by resort staff and the local police right through to the involvement of multiple international law enforcement agencies. And then there's the relentless scrutiny from the media and the public, too, just constant. So our mission today, really, is to try and sift through this enormous stack of sources. We're talking official police reports, witness statements, analyses of that intense media coverage, and try to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight for you.
Absolutely. And we need to navigate through that initial, let's face it, chaotic response. Then look at the evolving theories about what might have happened. The controversial early investigations by the Portuguese police are key here. And then the later extensive inquiries led by British and now German authorities. You'll hear about key sightings, the role sniffer dogs played, DNA analysis, the impact of being named an arguido or suspect in Portugal. And that really fascinating, sometimes quite fraught relationship between the investigation and the press.
Yeah, that raises a really important question, doesn't it? How do we as a society actually process these kinds of high-profile, unresolved mysteries? We'll explore the various perspectives, the conflicting pieces of information, all the things that have made this case so enduringly perplexing. The aim is to give you a thorough understanding, but hopefully without feeling completely overwhelmed by the sheer data overload.
Okay, so let's begin right there. In those first hours, Kate McCann discovers Madeleine is gone at 10 p.m. That initial search, it was almost entirely civilian-led, wasn't it? Resort staff, guests, a desperate hunt lasting into the early hours. But talk about the official police response. What were those critical missteps right at the start that ultimately hampered the investigation so much?
Oh, that's exactly it. That's where the foundation for years of, frustration was really laid. I mean, even simple fundamental protocols seem to have been missed. The first officers from the GNR, the Guardia Nacional Republicana, they didn't arrive until 11:10 p.m. And crucially, they failed to alert the criminal police, the PJ, the Police Judiciary, until midnight. The PJ themselves only arrived after 1 a.m. What's the impact of that kind of delay in a missing child case?
Well, you're losing those golden hours, aren't you? That critical window where every single minute counts. Not getting Madeleine's description out to border police, to marine police for many, many hours. Not conducting immediate house-to-house searches. And the roadblocks, they weren't put in place until 10 a.m. the next morning. It's almost unthinkable, really, for an investigation that became this huge.
And it goes beyond just the delays, unfortunately. The actual potential crime scene, apartment 5A, it wasn't properly secured. The PJ case file itself reveals it lay empty for a whole month before it was let out to tourists again. Only then, in August 2007, was it sealed off for more forensic tests. Can you imagine? A potential crime scene left open like that. There's even a note about an officer dusting for fingerprints on the bedroom window shutter without wearing gloves. So it's really no wonder that so much potential evidence was compromised or contaminated, especially when you hear that around 20 people apparently entered the apartment before it was finally closed off. It just highlights a critical insight, doesn't it? In any high-profile missing person case, those first few hours are absolutely vital. And even seemingly fundamental errors like these can just irrevocably compromise an entire investigation for years.
That really does set the stage for so much of the confusion that followed. Another critical point to bring in here is the often fraught relationship between the British and Portuguese police forces. Leicestershire Police coordinated the British side, but there was evident resentment from the PJ. British police were used to these advanced systems like Holmes 2, a sophisticated crime database for major inquiries. That was a really stark contrast to the Portuguese method, which involved, collecting information in physical boxes and needing magistrates' decisions for pretty much every step. One British official even described the Portuguese feeling sort of condescended to, like the British were acting like a colonial power.
And that friction certainly complicated things. Cross-border cooperation is just paramount in these international cases. But look, the procedural missteps were only one layer of the chaos, weren't they? Almost immediately, the media attention just exploded. It transformed this localized disappearance into a truly global phenomenon.
Absolutely. And the McCanns made a decision, quite an unusual one at the time, to actively market Madeleine, to keep her in the public eye. They brought in PR consultants. And this was apparently deeply resented by the local Portuguese police. They saw all this intense attention as counterproductive, right? How did that impact the investigation itself?
Well, it created an unprecedented situation, really. The case attracted sustained press coverage. People compared it to the death of Princess Diana. By early June 2007, journalists were already noting the sheer professionalism of the PR campaign. Madeleine was on the front page of British tabloids almost daily for nearly 6 months. Now, while this intense media spotlight certainly raised global awareness and it led to millions in donations for the search, it also, paradoxically perhaps, created huge challenges for investigators. It generated this environment of intense public scrutiny that you could argue sometimes overshadowed the actual methodical police work needed.
Right. So moving into that first official Portuguese inquiry between 2007 and 2008, just 12 days after Madeleine disappeared, Robert Murat became the first arguido, the first formal suspect. He was a British-Portuguese property consultant living very close to apartment 5A. And this was sparked by a journalist's tip, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. Murat was named a suspect apparently because a journalist felt he was asking too many questions about the case. And several members of the Top 7, that's the group the McCanns were dining with, whose statements became really critical. And also some resort staff reported seeing him near apartment 5A shortly after the disappearance was raised. Now, this wasn't maybe surprising given he lived so close, but he and his mother maintained he was home all evening. His home was searched thoroughly, pool drained, vehicles, electronics examined. Nothing linked him to the disappearance. His arguido status was lifted in July 2008, and he later received significant libel damages from newspapers over false allegations. It's just a stark reminder, isn't it, how quickly seemingly innocuous details can lead to someone becoming a suspect, even without any direct evidence.
And alongside Murat, there were various witness statements emerging around that time. Descriptions of men behaving oddly near apartment 5A in the days leading up to it. Scotland Yard later came to believe these men might have been doing reconnaissance, maybe for an abduction, maybe for a burglary. What's compelling here is that there had actually been a big jump, a fourfold increase in burglaries in that area that year, including 2 right there in the McCann's block where intruders got in through windows.
And then you have those particularly interesting details from the charity collector sightings. Several witnesses reported seeing men, described sometimes as bedraggled, sometimes polite, asking for money for a non-existent orphanage in a nearby village, Espiche. Some were apparently pushy or intimidating. On the very day Madeleine vanished, there were 4 such collections reported by 2 men in the streets right around apartment 5A. Plus, there were sightings of an ugly blonde-haired man watching 5A in the days before, and 2 blonde-haired men seen on a balcony of an empty apartment nearby on the day itself. These details, they do paint a picture, potentially, of pre-abduction surveillance, suggests a degree of planning, perhaps, that points away from just a spontaneous opportunist.
And this is where the initial timeline and some of those early assumptions really started to unravel. It led, quite dramatically, to suspicion shifting towards the McCanns themselves. The first sort of public indication came on June 6, 2007. A German journalist just outright asked them if they were involved. Then a Portuguese weekly paper, Sol, published an article alleging they were suspects. It highlighted inconsistencies in their accounts and implied that the famous Tanner sighting was actually invented.
Ah, yes, the Tanner sighting. That was where Jane Tanner, one of the Tepa 7, saw a man carrying a child away from the resort around 9:15 p.m. It was initially treated as a key piece of the puzzle, right? But Scotland Yard, much later, debunked this. They identified the man as a completely innocent British holidaymaker carrying his own daughter back from the resort creche. Now, this wasn't just a minor correction, it effectively removed a really critical early piece of evidence and allowed investigators to refocus on another sighting by Martin and Mary Smith around 10 p.m. They saw a man carrying a child, possibly in pajamas, near the beach road, heading away from the apartment area. Scotland Yard concluded in 2013 that this was more likely the approximate time of Madeleine's kidnapping, which significantly altered that crucial timeline.
And those accusations against the McCanns, often based on, well, frankly, no evidence, just spiraled, especially on social media later on. They were accused of sedating their children, of forming a pact of silence with their friends. There was intense scrutiny of every detail in their statements to police. Little inconsistencies, like whether they used the front or the back patio door to check on the children, or whether the bedroom shutter could actually be opened from the outside without force. All these fueled police suspicion that maybe there hadn't been an abduction at all. It really highlights how quickly initial, sometimes quite minor inconsistencies can just be weaponized against people under that kind of intense pressure.
It's important, I think, to understand the theory the Portuguese police developed at that time. Essentially, they came to suspect that Madeleine had died in an accident inside apartment 5A, perhaps after being accidentally overdosed with a sedative, and that her parents had then hidden her body and faked the abduction to cover it up. This wasn't just speculation. It was publicly stated by a former head of the Police Detectives Union in Portugal, Carlos Anjos, as late as 2010. He said most Portuguese investigators still believe this version of events. This suspicion was really intensified when the McCann suggested using a rather unusual technique, a matter orientation system, by a guy called Danny Krugel. The lead detective at the time, Gonçalo Amaral, controversially interpreted this as some kind of ploy by them to disclose the location of the body indirectly.
And this theory really gained momentum, didn't it, with the arrival of the British sniffer dogs, Keela and Eddie, in July 2007. Keela was trained to detect human blood. Eddie was a cadaver dog, trained to detect human remains. Both dogs alerted behind the sofa in apartment 5A. Eddie, the cadaver dog, also alerted near the wardrobe. And then, significantly, Eddie gave an alert outside the driver's door of the Renault Scenic McCanns had hired, but this was 24 days after Madeleine vanished. Kilo, the blood dog, alerted inside the boot and on the key map compartment area.
Right. And forensic analysis of samples taken from these areas by the Forensic Science Service, the FSS, in Birmingham followed. Now, crucially, the FSS used a technique called low copy number, or LCN, DNA testing. This is highly sensitive, but also quite controversial because it's very vulnerable to contamination, especially with tiny or degraded samples. Now, while a sample from the car boot did contain 15 out of Madeleine's 19 known DNA components, the FSS ultimately stated the result was, and I quote, too complex for meaningful interpretation. And they explicitly said they cannot answer the question, is the match genuine or is it a chance match? Brought that ambiguity is such a critical point of contention. It shows how even advanced forensic science can give you results that are, well, inconclusive.
But despite that scientific ambiguity, Portuguese journalists were reportedly told that DNA evidence was a 100% match, which of course led to those explosive tabloid headlines like Corpse in McCann car. Just devastating. And on September 7, 2007, both Kate and Jerry McCann were formally given arguido status, made suspects. Kate, acting on legal advice, declined to answer 48 questions during an incredibly long 11-hour interview, which, understandably perhaps from the PJ's perspective, only seemed to deepen their suspicion. The Almeida report, which was a Portuguese police document summarizing their findings at that stage, concluded Madeleine had died accidentally, and that her parents had faked the abduction, even suggesting that Tapa's 7 friends had helped mislead the police.
And adding another layer to this, there was a leaked diplomatic cable later on from the U.S. ambassador to Portugal. It noted that the British ambassador had apparently admitted that British police had developed the current evidence against the McCann parents, and so. However, it's really important to add that both the McCann twins and Kate herself were later drug tested back in the UK at the McCann's own request, and no trace of any sedatives or other relevant drugs was found. That directly rebutted some of those earlier allegations about sedation. It's just a prime example of how quickly unverified information, or partial information, can spread and become almost ingrained in the public narrative.
The lead detective, Inspector Gonçalo Amaral, he was removed from the inquiry in October 2007. This was after he publicly criticized the British police. He later resigned from the force altogether, and he wrote his book, Maddie, The Truth of the Lie, which continued to push that theory, accidental death, faked abduction. This led to a really prolonged legal battle, with the McCanns initially winning, then losing libel appeals against him. And the Supreme Court of Portugal ultimately ruled in 2017 that the McCanns had not, in fact, been cleared simply by the archiving of the original criminal case back in 2008, a complex legal point.
Right. And simultaneously, you had the McCanns establishing Madeleine's Fund. This was to raise money, keep awareness high. It attracted, incredible attention, over 80 million website visits in just the first 3 months. The fund hired several private investigation firms over the years. One was Oakley International. They focused quite heavily on that Smith sighting, the man seen carrying a child near the beach road around 10 p.m. And they produced EFITs, composite images, based on the Smith's description. Now, this became a bit sensitive because Martin Smith had initially thought the man he saw resembled Jerry McCann, though he later accepted he was mistaken. The fund initially chose not to release these EFITs publicly, which itself later led to a libel case against the Sunday Times when the paper implied the McCanns had deliberately withheld them from the police. It just illustrates that tightrope walk, doesn't it? Managing public perception while trying to assist a critical, ongoing investigation?
All of this eventually brings us to the British police getting more deeply involved, doesn't it? The McCanns met the British Home Secretary back in 2009, requesting a formal review of the case. This led to something called the Gamble Report. And this report was pretty critical, actually. It heavily criticized the lack of coordination among the various British agencies involved initially, noting that everyone wanted to help or perhaps, quote, be seen to help, which apparently created chaos and competition and actually hampered the inquiry and caused resentment with the Portuguese police.
Yeah, that report really did set the stage for Operation Grange. That was the big Scotland Yard review launched in May 2011. It started with a team of 29 detectives, and its launch came after a campaign by the Sun newspaper, which published an open letter from the McCanns asking for a new inquiry. Operation Grange, led initially by DCI Andy Redwood, made it very clear from the outset they were looking at a criminal act by a stranger. Most likely scenarios, they thought, were either a planned abduction or possibly a burglary that went wrong. They did scale back the operation significantly in 2015, but they continued to pursue what they called a significant line of inquiry even in 2017. This marked a really crucial turning point, didn't it? Publicly moving the focus away from theories involving the parents and concentrating on external perpetrators.
And then, after years of stalled progress, speculation, theories, the whole landscape of the investigation just fundamentally shifted in 2020. German authorities made a dramatic announcement. They declared Christian Brickner as their prime suspect, stating they have concrete evidence, their words, that he killed Madeleine McCann. Now, Brickner has a known history of child sexual abuse and drug trafficking. And crucially, he was living in the Algarve region at the time, in a borrowed VW camper van. His mobile phone signal was traced to the Praia da Luz area within about 5 minutes of Madeleine's disappearance, and his former girlfriend even claimed he told her he had a horrible job to do in Praia da Luz the night before Madeleine vanished. This new focus, it just brought an entirely different dimension to a case many thought would likely never have such a strong lead again.
It really is a significant shift, moving away from those earlier theories of, accidental death or an opportunistic crime. Now, formal charges against Bruckner in relation to Madeleine have been delayed, partly due to complex jurisdictional issues between Germany and Portugal. But Portuguese authorities did give him formal arguido status in April 2022. That allows them potentially to extradite him for questioning specifically on this case. And the recent searches really underscore that this is still very much an active investigation, like the one in May 2023 near the Red Dam Reservoir, which Bruckner apparently used to visit, and another search more recently in June 2025 in an area between Praia da Luz and Bruckner's former cottage. These searches involved heavy machinery, ground-penetrating radar, really serious efforts, though reports suggest the 2025 search so far yielded fairly limited findings, things like animal bones. But this continuous, painstaking effort just demonstrates the sheer resolve to find answers, even after all this time, even decades later.
And woven through this entire story from the very beginning has been the immense role of the tabloids and later social media, creating what many people have described as trial by media. Twitter was only about a year old in 2007, but it eventually became a real source of widespread, often vile, vitriol against the McCanns. The #McCann hashtag, even now, apparently still produces over 100 tweets an hour sometimes. It's extraordinary. People went to horrible extremes, threatening the McCanns twins, even trying to sabotage police appeals by flooding them with false information.
Yeah, the McCanns faced just intense public scrutiny and criticism, didn't they? Particularly for that decision to leave the children unattended while they ate nearby. Kate McCann, in particular, was, monstered, seems the only word for it by parts of the media. Her appearance, her demeanor, constantly dissected, critics calling her cold or accusing her of not crying enough in public. People drew comparisons to Lindy Chamberlain in Australia, who was also falsely accused, partly because she didn't weep publicly in the way people expected. It just highlights how intensely a public narrative can be shaped by perceptions, often completely separate from the actual facts of the case.
The Leveson inquiry into British press standards, held later, heard some really damning evidence about this, particularly concerning the Daily Express's sustained campaign of vitriol against the family. Headlines like, "Maddie sold by hard-up McCanns," or "Madeleine McCann had been killed by sleeping pills." Lord Justice Leveson himself called these stories complete piffle.
And all of this inevitably led to significant libel actions. The McCanns and the Tapas 7 group received substantial damages and public apologies from Express newspapers. Robert Murat, the first arguido, received £600,000 from 11 different newspapers for the false allegations made against him. That figure alone highlights just how widespread the media misconduct was in relation to this case. It really reveals the immense power and also the potential for real harm that unchecked media speculation can wield in these high-profile investigations.
So after all that, what does this all mean? As we bring this deep dive to a close, it's crystal clear that the disappearance of Madeleine McCann remains an enduring, painful mystery. Despite nearly 2 decades of intensive multinational investigations, we've seen the sheer determination of her parents through things like Madeleine's Fund, we've seen the immense challenges faced by the different police forces involved, and we've tracked that shifting focus from initial theories like a burglary gone wrong, or even tragically parental involvement, right through to the current very specific focus on a German suspect.
And if we try to connect this to the bigger picture, I think it really highlights some key things. The immense difficulty of solving cases when there are significant initial missteps, like securing a crime scene properly. The complexities of international police cooperation, especially when there's friction or different procedures. And of course, the profound, almost overwhelming influence of media coverage and public opinion on an investigation. Looking back at the detailed insights, witness accounts, the forensic findings, even those controversial libel actions, it demonstrates how every single piece of information, no matter how small or seemingly contradictory, contributes to the overall narrative. And it creates these layers upon layers of complexity that are just incredibly hard to untangle.
Exactly. And those ongoing searches, even now in 2025, near the original resort area and near the suspect's former residence, they just underscore that this isn't just some historical event we're looking back on. It's an active, incredibly painful, and still evolving case for everyone involved. And you've seen how just one piece of information, like a mobile phone signal pinging at a certain time and place, can open up entirely new avenues years, even decades later. It keeps that hope for some kind of resolution alive, doesn't it?
What really stands out to you, though, after going through all this material again? For me, it's how a single missing person case, however tragic, can just snowball into this global phenomenon,
Oh,
absorbing vast resources, generating literally endless discussion and speculation online and offline. And yet still it eludes a definitive conclusion. It's a testament, I suppose, to human perseverance, the parents, the investigators, but also maybe to the intractable nature of some mysteries.
it really makes you think, doesn't it? About the nature of information itself, the power of public engagement for good and ill, and just that relentless human pursuit of answers, even when they seem impossible to find. This deep dive into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, I think it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to mull over. In an age like ours, absolutely saturated with information, how do we balance our deep desire for knowledge, for resolution, with the inherent ambiguities, the frustrating unknowns of these kinds of unsolved mysteries, especially the ones that captivate us so profoundly?